I'd like to just write a really simple, basic application that will take data and store it out in the cloud in parse.com using the parse.com SDK. So no user authentication, simply set up a project so that it's using parse and I can simply save data and then retrieve data. So that's the most basic functionality. To accomplish this, we need to download the parse SDK, and we have a couple of options. If we have an existing project, we can just download the SDK and we can manually configure our project. If you're writing a brand new project, Parse provides us with a starter project, a project that's essentially just empty, and that project will have everything set up already, all the dependencies, copies of the Parse framework, and it'll even stub out some of the boilerplate code that we just got to plug in our app ID. So let's, on this first demo, let's take that approach. So I scrolled down to the bottom of the parse.com webpage and clicked on download, and then you can see there's a number of options here, and I'm going to go with, I've already downloaded the SDK, and I'll show you that in the next demo where I manually configure an existing project. But for this demo, I'm simply going to take this blank project. It's just a blank project with a storyboard and a view controller, but it's all set up to do parse right out of the box. So I'm going to click on this blank project, and it's going to download here. And we'll go off and find it. Oh, it looks like it's unpacking it for me. And there it is. Okay, so there's two projects in the zip. There's a Swift Starter and just a normal one, which is Objective-C. So I'm going to take this Swift Starter project and copy it to my buffer. So I select this, copy it, and I'm going to go over to where I'm doing my work here. And let's make a new project or a new directory for lecture 8. Oops, should spell it right. And I'll paste in that my project, and there it is. And I'm going to simply open this project now in Xcode. And if we look inside here, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of frameworks, parse framework code that's been added to this. And the other thing I need is, excuse me, the other thing I need is I need to create a parse application up on the parse platform. So I've already created my account, and I'm just going to go up here and create a new app. So I'll say create a new app. What's the name of your new app? Parse persist data demo, and I'll click create. And that's all there is to it. It's set it up. So if we go into here under settings and keys, we'll find the two pieces of information that I need. So the first one is app ID, so I'm going to copy that by clicking that button. Go back to Xcode, and in my app delegate, you'll see everything's all stubbed out, and all I need to do is uncomment this code right here. This is where I set the application ID, and I'm going to replace this with that ID. Then I'll switch back here, grab the client key, and paste that right there. Okay, so that is all I need there. And now I want to write some data, and then I'll add a button with an action where I'll read that same data that I wrote. So I'm going to go into my view did load of this controller. And I'm just going to add some code, and notice how it did the imports for me automatically up there as well in this view controller. So I'm going to add some code here to simply persist some data. So we do this with a PF object. So I'll say let my test object equals PF object, and we can give it a class name, and this can be anything I want. We'll say widgets. And then I can add some data on it, so I could say object name equals junk widget, test object description okay. So I can just store attributes, data on there. And yeah, you can store images as well. It's a multi-step process though. Okay, there is some tutorials on Parse for doing that. So you have to save it as a file, and then you can put the name of that file as an attribute in one of these objects. Okay. Then I'm going to save this data. So we do that, you'll recall, by saying save in background, and we'll give it a block. And my block here returns a success boolean and an error, which is of type NSError optional. And the code here, I'm simply going to just say object has been saved to let me know it got saved. And that's it. So let's go ahead and run this and just confirm that in fact my application is able to persist this data in the cloud. It looks like I got a clean build. So let me go ahead and run it. Alright, I'm expecting my debug thingy here. Okay, it was just too small. So you can see down here, it did print out that line. So everything from the client side looks like it works. So let's swap over to the web browser. And let's go and refresh here. Okay, and notice now I've got over here on the left a table called widgets. If I click that, you'll notice I indeed have this object persisted there now. Right? So I've written data, stored data from my client up to the cloud without really having to write any code in the cloud. And now let's do the opposite. Let's go and fetch this data. Let's do a query and read this data back down. So I'm going to go back into my storyboard, and I'm just going to add a little button out here. And when you press that button, I'm going to read the data. So I'll just put a little label on here, read the data, and I'll wire that button up to an action, and we'll call that action read data and connect it. So let's write a simple query to actually read this data in when the button is pressed. So we're going to say query, and this is going to be a PF query object. And again, we give it a class name just like we did when we created it with a PF object. And we'll use the same class name I used above, so this will be widgets. And I've only written one so far. Now there's all kinds of different ways to query. We can set up basically conditions. We can do the equivalent of select from and all that. All the stuff you typically do in a database query, you can do that with PF query. But I'm just going to try to read the very first one that's out there. So I can do that by saying query.get first object in background with block, and the object here is of type PF object optional, and then I have an air object as well, which is NS air optional. And for code here, I'm simply going to do some checking to make sure I got something back. So what happens is the query happens, and as soon as the query data is back, or we got an error, so whenever we have some disposition on this operation, our closure expression is going to get called. So in my closure expression, I'm going to check, first of all, did I get an object back? So if that's non-nil and the error is equal to nil, that must mean everything went well. I've got something back here. So now I could say let widget equal, and I can unwrap my object, and I can simply say object for key, and let's see, let's just go with name, and that's a string. And then at that point I can print it out, and if this isn't true, then we will print out the error. So now, if we run this, and I click on my read button, you can see it's actually reading the data back.